I mean, the Biennale as an event is an interesting one, and I think the interesting question is, what is the relevance of the Biennale today? Because the origin of the Biennale, like the salons, was about bringing people together to provoke each other, to discuss issues that might be topical, or to surface younger talent, for example. In today's context, I think we have to rethink what the Biennale is doing, and I think the provocative themes are more likely to succeed because they push the envelope. But I think one problem, if I have to be critical in a positive way, would be that I think biennales are not speculating enough about the future. And speculating about the future doesn't mean just imagining the future in a science fiction way, but imagining the future based on the data of the present. Because architecture is about imagining spatial possibilities in which our lives are better. That's what society puts a big investment on us to do. And so I think it is contingent on the Biennale to have a dimension which is not about architects just reflecting on their past practices, but actually trying to project what the present tells us about the possibilities of the future. And I hope the Biennale expands itself into that space. We have participated in 3 biennales. The first biennale we participated in was Ricky Burdett was the curator, and his biennale was about cities, and we presented work on Mumbai. And for me and our practice, it was very important because we had to zoom out to look at our own city and our context. And so it really expanded the way we imagined our practice situated in a particular place. The second biennale that we participated in was the biennale with Alejandro Aravena, and there he asked us to share with him our research on the Kumbh Mela and on ephemeral urbanism, and we called it Does Permanence Matter? And for us it again expanded a whole discussion in our minds about are working in a place like India where the temporal landscape is a very big part, and we had never articulated that to communicate it. And we realized that was a very important aspect of the structure in which we work, where time becomes important, because as architects and planners we have no really good way to bring time into our imagination. And yes, with architecture we talk about weathering and how buildings age, but how do you use time productively to project the future? And planning is where you really need to situate it. And so for us, the Aravena provocation was to look at the question of, does permanence matter? Is permanence too much of a default condition for architecture in pedagogy and in practice? And so that was very productive. And for us, free space is really the space that is the space of generosity. It's the space outside the capitalist imagination of usable space and space that you can make a profit on. But the way we responded to the notion of free space is with a qualification. And our exhibition here is called Soft Thresholds, because we said that if you don't have soft thresholds, you can't have free space, because the threshold in architecture is a very important element, because it implicitly or explicitly tells you what you can enter and what you can't enter. Yeah, so today, for example, in a glass building, which is a corporate office, you have an access panel, and unless you know the code or your biometrics, you can't go in. That's a hard threshold, for good reason, but it's a hard threshold. A soft threshold or a semi-soft threshold is maybe in a church and a mosque, where the threshold is defined by a beautiful door or a marble threshold, and you touch it in a symbol of reverence as you go in. So you acknowledge a moment of transgression, but you're allowed to make that transgression. And then there are softer spaces in forms of public spaces which everyone can mingle and transgress. And so for us, our response to free space was, let's not forget the threshold, because we can't have free space unless the thresholds are soft. The notion of thresholds, and by extension the description of a soft threshold, is a historic topic. It's what architecture does is architecture can separate people, or architecture can connect people, right? Mosques and churches and places of religious worship gather people without discrimination, right? Places of consumption and that are capitalistic create a new kind of caste system or hierarchy. And in all of this, the threshold and the way we create the edge of our buildings or our urban spaces that either are filters or they are welcoming is a historic question in architecture. And I think the nature of every society defines how that threshold is articulated, right? Societies that discriminate against ethnicities or discriminate against the poor create these thresholds in a way to disallow people, to separate people. And architecture that's more generous, sometimes in a subversive way, creates the spaces that people can transgress each other. And even the illusion of transgression, that if I can even make eye contact with you through a glass that is transparent, is a good thing. It's better than having a reflective glass where you see your face from the outside but you don't see what I'm doing inside. And so this is a very subtle, complicated and highly political question, but it's always existed. But it manifests itself, I think, in much more brutal ways, at least in today's world. And maybe it did in the medieval times, who knows, we didn't live there. But in today's world, with globalization, neoliberalism, the state receding, the inequities, the displacement of people around the globe, I think it's a very relevant question they've asked about free space. But with free space, we can't forget the threshold that connects or divides. For the Biennale, and in response to the theme of free space and our theme of soft thresholds, we curated 3 projects. And we wanted to curate them across a spectrum. So we curated a government project, which is a low-cost, low-income housing project for very poor people. But these are interesting people, they're very poorly paid, but they look after elephants. And so the animal also became a part of the project. The second project we selected was a corporate building for an infrastructure company, which is interested in an image of globalization and neoliberalism. And the third project we selected was an institutional project, which is a School of Architecture, and a building we did in the School of Architecture. And so in all these 3 projects, what we've tried to do is take very pragmatic, challenging contemporary questions of infrastructure, of climate control, of sustainability, but use it in a way that the most disempowered in society are empowered through making the buildings intelligent in this sort of low-cost, low-tech way.